September 1st, 1939, arrived with the roar of German bombers over Warsaw. And among the thousands of young Polish men rushing to defend their homeland stood Witold Pilecki, a cavalry officer whose destiny would intertwine with some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. The ground trembled beneath his boots as panzer divisions crushed through Polish defences like iron fists through paper. The sky darkened not with storm clouds but with the smoke of burning villages, and the screams of civilians mingled with the thunder of artillery that would reshape Europe forever. Pilecki had been born in Karelia in 1901, when Poland still existed only in the hearts of its scattered people. His father had instilled in him an unshakable belief that Poland deserved freedom, that no foreign power, whether German, Russian, or Austrian, had the right to erase a nation from the map. When Poland finally regained independence after World War I, young Witold had joined the military academy, dedicating himself to the protection of his reborn nation. He married Maria Ostrowska in 1931, settled into a quiet life managing a family estate, and raised 2 children. But quiet lives had no place in the storm that was gathering over Europe. The September campaign lasted barely 5 weeks. German forces attacked from the west while the world watched in horror. But an even greater betrayal came on September 17th, when Soviet forces invaded from the east. Poland found itself caught between 2 totalitarian giants who had secretly agreed to carve up the country between themselves. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, documented extensively in declassified Soviet archives and referenced in Norman Davies's historical work Rising 44, Poland would cease to exist as an independent state, divided into German and Soviet occupation zones. Pilecki fought in several desperate battles during those chaotic weeks. His cavalry unit engaged German forces near the Wola district, where outdated tactics met modern warfare with predictable results. Horses charged against tanks, sabers against machine guns, bravery against overwhelming firepower. Yet, even in defeat, Pilecki refused to surrender. When the Polish government fled into exile and the military command structure collapsed, thousands of soldiers simply went home or surrendered. Pilecki made a different choice. He helped establish one of the first resistance organizations in occupied Poland, the Secret Polish Army, in November 1939. Working underground meant living with constant fear of discovery, of betrayal by neighbors or colleagues who might be collaborators or simply desperate people trying to survive. German occupation brought immediate terror to Warsaw. Mass arrests began within weeks, targeting intellectuals, military officers, priests, and anyone who might organize resistance. Public executions became common, bodies left hanging in market squares as warnings. The Gestapo operated with ruthless efficiency, their black leather coats becoming symbols of sudden disappearances and midnight raids. Meanwhile, reports filtered in from the Soviet-occupied territories of similar horrors. Mass deportations to Siberian labor camps, executions of Polish officers, the systematic destruction of Polish culture and identity. Pilecki understood with chilling clarity that Poland faced not merely military occupation, but deliberate annihilation. Caught between 2 regimes that viewed Polish independence as an intolerable threat to their imperial ambitions. September 19, 1940 marked an impossible decision that would define Witold Pilecki's place in history. Standing in a safe house in Warsaw with fellow resistance members, he proposed an idea so audacious that his comrades initially thought he had lost his mind. Reports had reached the underground of a new German camp established near the town of Auschwitz, which the Germans now called Auschwitz. Thousands of Polish political prisoners were disappearing into this place, and no reliable information was emerging about conditions inside or the fate of those imprisoned there. Pilecki's plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. He would deliberately allow himself to be captured during a German street roundup and sent to Auschwitz. Once inside, he would establish an intelligence network, gather evidence of German crimes, build a resistance organization among the prisoners, and prepare for a potential uprising if the Polish government in exile could coordinate a rescue operation. His fellow officers protested vehemently. They argued that volunteering for certain imprisonment and probable death made no strategic sense, that he was too valuable to the resistance outside the camps. But Pilecki remained unmoved by their arguments. Someone had to discover what was happening inside German concentration camps, had to organize the prisoners, had to prove that even in the worst hell the Nazis could create, Polish resistance would continue. He spent several days arranging false identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafisky, and positioning himself in a Warsaw neighborhood where German forces regularly conducted Łapanka raids, random roundups of civilians for forced labor or imprisonment. On September 19th, he stood on a Warsaw street during a German raid, deliberately failing to flee when others ran. German soldiers grabbed him along with 2,000 other men, herding them into trucks with rifle butts and shouted threats. The captured men were first taken to a transit camp, then loaded onto trains. Pilecki maintained his false identity during brutal interrogations, enduring beatings without revealing his military background or resistance connections. The journey to Auschwitz took 2 days in overcrowded cattle cars without food, water, or sanitation. The train arrived at Auschwitz on September 22, 1940. The camp had been established only 4 months earlier, in June 1940, initially intended for Polish political prisoners. As Pilecki and his fellow prisoners stumbled from the train, Sturmscharfe Gerhard Palitz greeted them with a speech that would prove prophetically horrific. "You have come to a German concentration camp from which the only exit is through the chimney. If anyone doesn't like it, he can try hanging himself on the wires. If there are Jews in the transport, they have the right to live no longer than 2 weeks. Priests, 1 month. The rest, 3 months. The prisoners were stripped, their heads shaved, every personal belonging confiscated. Pilecki became prisoner number 4,335. Numbers replaced names. Humanity replaced with systematic dehumanization. Guards beat prisoners randomly for entertainment, forcing them to stand at attention for hours in freezing weather, withholding food until men collapsed from exhaustion. The work details were designed not for productivity but for destruction. Prisoners forced to carry heavy stones from one pile to another and then back again, meaningless labor intended only to break their spirits and bodies. Yet, even in these first horrific days, Pilecki began his mission. He carefully observed the camp's layout, noted the schedules of guard changes, identified prisoners who seemed trustworthy, and started the delicate process of building an underground network. Historical records from the Auschwitz Museum, as documented in Polish historian Wisław Wysocki's research, confirm that Pilecki's intelligence network eventually grew to include nearly 1,000 prisoners across various work details and camp sections. January 15, 1941 found Witold Pilecki barely recognizable from the man who had entered Auschwitz 4 months earlier. His weight had dropped from roughly 170 pounds to less than 120. His skin stretched tight over prominent bones, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Yet the mind behind those eyes remained sharp and focused on his impossible mission. Winter in Auschwitz meant death arrived even faster than usual. Prisoners wore thin striped uniforms that provided almost no protection against Polish winters that regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp had expanded dramatically since Pilecki's arrival. What had begun as a prison for Polish political dissidents was evolving into something far more sinister. German efficiency was turning Auschwitz into an industrialized death machine. New barracks were being constructed constantly, and Pilecki noticed that Jewish prisoners were arriving in increasing numbers and being subjected to even worse treatment than Polish political prisoners. The hierarchy of suffering in Nazi camps placed Jews at the absolute bottom, marked for eventual extermination rather than merely exploitation. Pilecki had managed to recruit several key individuals into his underground network. He worked primarily through five-man cells, a structure that limited exposure if any member was caught and tortured into revealing information. Each cell leader knew only Pilecki and the members of their own cell, creating a compartmentalized structure that protected the broader organization. Colonel Władysław Samacki, a fellow officer imprisoned in the camp, became one of his most trusted collaborators. They communicated through coded messages hidden in work assignments, through whispered conversations during the rare moments guards weren't watching, through a complex system of signals that appeared innocent to casual observers. The network served multiple purposes beyond intelligence gathering. They distributed extra food to prisoners closest to death, organized mutual support systems to help men survive the psychological torture, passed information about prisoner transports and German activities, and maintained connections with the outside world through civilian workers who entered the camp daily. Polish civilians working in nearby factories or as forced laborers sometimes sympathized with the prisoners and were willing to smuggle messages out and occasionally bring small amounts of food or medicine in. One such contact was Helena Stupka, a pharmacy assistant in the nearby town who received Pilecki's first messages in October 1940. According to records maintained by the Polish underground study Trust in London, these messages contained detailed information about camp conditions, prisoner numbers, death rates, and the systematic murder program that was beginning to take shape. Stupka passed the information to resistance contacts, who forwarded it through underground channels to the Polish government in exile in London. The British received Pilecki's reports but struggled to believe their contents. The systematic, industrial-scale murder he described seemed too horrific to be real. British intelligence analysts suspected the reports were exaggerated, perhaps propaganda designed to manipulate Allied policy. This tragic disbelief meant that accurate information about Nazi extermination programs reached Allied governments years before they took decisive action, but was dismissed as impossible or unreliable. Meanwhile, Pilecki's daily existence remained a constant battle for survival. Work details in the gravel pit meant 10 to 12 hours of brutal physical labor on starvation rations. Guards beat prisoners who worked too slowly, shot those who collapsed from exhaustion, hanged those caught in minor infractions. Public executions occurred regularly at the Black Wall in the courtyard between blocks 10 and 11, where prisoners were forced to watch as their fellow inmates were shot. The psychological impact of witnessing constant death while being powerless to prevent it drove many prisoners to suicide by running into the electrified fence or simply giving up the will to live. June 22, 1941 brought news that rippled through the Auschwitz underground network with profound implications. Nazi Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invading the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops along an 1,800-mile front. For prisoners like Pilecki, who understood the broader strategic situation, this represented both hope and terror. Hope because Germany was now fighting a two-front war that would eventually strain even its formidable military machine. Terror because the ideological war against Bolshevism meant an intensification of Nazi racial policies. The invasion's impact on Auschwitz was immediate and catastrophic. Soviet prisoners of war began arriving in massive numbers, and the SS viewed them with even greater contempt than they held for Polish political prisoners or Jews. In September 1941, the SS conducted the first experiments with Zyklon B gas in Block 11, murdering 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish prisoners. This marked a turning point in the camp's evolution from a brutal concentration camp into an extermination facility. Pilecki's intelligence network documented these experiments in reports smuggled out to the resistance. He described how prisoners were packed into sealed basement rooms, how SS officers dropped Zyklon B pellets through openings in the ceiling, how the screams lasted approximately 20 minutes before silence fell. The bodies were then cremated in a makeshift facility, but the volume of murders was already exceeding the camp's disposal capacity. The SS began planning larger, more efficient killing facilities. The atmosphere in the camp grew even more nightmarish as 1942 began. The Wannsee Conference in January of that year formalized the final solution: the Nazi plan for the complete extermination of European Jews. Auschwitz would become the primary killing center for this genocidal program. Construction began on massive new facilities at nearby Betrayal, including for large gas chambers and crematoria designed to murder and dispose of thousands of people per day. Pilecki watched this machinery of death being constructed with growing horror and determination. His resistance organization now included nearly 1,000 members across the expanding camp complex. They had managed to acquire some weapons, small knives and tools that could serve as improvised arms, hidden in various locations throughout the camp. The plan was to coordinate an uprising with an attack from outside by Polish partisan forces and possibly Allied paratroopers. Messages flowed regularly to London through underground channels, increasingly desperate pleas for military intervention. But the responses from London grew vaguer and less committal. The Polish government in exile lacked resources for a major rescue operation, and the British remained focused on their own strategic priorities. The full scope of Nazi extermination programs was still not fully believed or understood by Allied leadership. Pilecki's detailed reports competed with other intelligence priorities, filed away in bureaucratic systems that couldn't process information that seemed to come from a nightmare rather than reality. The selections became routine and horrifying. New transports arrived almost daily, mostly Jews from across occupied Europe. They were unloaded from cattle cars onto the ramp at Birkenau, where SS doctors made snap judgments about who was fit for labor and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. Elderly, children, pregnant women, the sick, typically 70 to 80% of each transport, were murdered within hours of arrival. Those selected for work joined the existing prisoner population, temporarily spared but facing slow death through starvation, disease, and brutal labor. Pilecki's network tried to help where possible. They would warn new prisoners about the selection process, advising them to claim skills that might be valuable, to lie about their age or health if necessary. They shared information about which work details were most survivable, which guards were most dangerous, which capos, prisoner supervisors, might show mercy or could be bribed. These small acts of resistance and solidarity saved some lives, though the numbers killed daily soon reached into the thousands, making individual rescue efforts feel like emptying an ocean with a teaspoon. April 26, 1943 was the day Witold Pilecki concluded that no rescue was coming from outside, that his intelligence reports were being received but not acted upon, and that remaining in Auschwitz would only add his name to the growing list of the dead without accomplishing anything further. He had spent 918 days inside the camp, longer than almost any prisoner could survive, sustained only by his iron will and the protection his resistance network could provide. But even that was failing now, as the SS increased security measures and conducted regular purges of suspected resistance members. The decision to escape came after careful consideration. Pilecki's network had thoroughly mapped the camp's security, identified patterns in guard rotations, observed sightlines from the watchtowers, and noted where the electrified perimeter fence might be most vulnerable. Several previous escape attempts by other prisoners had failed catastrophically. The SS maintained a standing policy that if any prisoner escaped, 10 prisoners from his block would be selected for death by starvation in the underground bunker. This collective punishment was designed to make prisoners police each other, to ensure that escape attempts would be betrayed by fellow inmates desperate to avoid collective responsibility. But Pilecki had maintained discipline among his network, and the men he selected to escape with him understood the broader mission. They would carry detailed intelligence to the outside world, reports that were far more comprehensive than what could be smuggled out in brief coded messages. They would advocate directly to military commands for action against Auschwitz. 2 other prisoners would join him: Jan Redzij, a resistance member working in the camp bakery, and Edward Cecilski, who had access to the camp warehouse where civilian workers' clothing was stored. The escape plan exploited a vulnerability in the camp's outer work details. A German company called Deutsche Ausrüstungswerk operated a factory just outside the main camp perimeter. Prisoners assigned to work there left the main camp under guard but had slightly more freedom of movement during work hours. Pilecki and his companions had managed to get assigned to the night shift at the bakery, which delivered bread to this factory. The bakery operated 24 hours, and a nighttime delivery detail included only a single SS guard, who had proven somewhat less vigilant than others. On the night of April 26th, with a moonless sky providing additional cover, the 3 men made their move. They had stolen civilian clothing that Cecilski had hidden in sacks supposedly containing flour. As they loaded the bakery truck for delivery, they waited until the guard became distracted, then slipped into a storage building. They changed quickly from their striped prisoner uniforms into the civilian clothes, walked calmly to the factory gate, taking advantage of a moment when the searchlight from the nearest watchtower was pointed in another direction, cut through a fence using tools Reg had stolen from the bakery, and began running toward the forest. The alarm sirens began wailing approximately 30 minutes later when a head count revealed the missing prisoners. Searchlights swept across the fields surrounding the camp. Guard units with dogs spread out in pursuit patterns. The SS had extensive experience tracking escaped prisoners, and the surrounding area was heavily patrolled by German forces. Most escapees were recaptured within hours, brought back to the camp, and publicly executed as warnings to others. The 3 men could hear dogs barking in the distance as they pushed deeper into the forest, running despite exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that recapture meant certain death under torture. They had prepared for this moment by memorizing safe house locations maintained by the resistance in nearby villages. The first refuge came just before dawn: a farmer who was part of the underground network. He hid them in his barn, provided food and water, and sent word through resistance channels that Pilecki was alive and free. Over the next week, they moved through a series of safe houses, gradually making their way toward Warsaw approximately 180 miles west of Auschwitz. The journey required constant vigilance. German checkpoints appeared without warning on major roads. Collaborators and informers existed in many communities. People desperate enough or ideological enough to betray resistance members for rewards. The three men traveled mostly at night, sleeping in barns and forests during daylight hours, relying on contacts who could provide false papers, money, and information about German troop movements. They reached Warsaw in early May 1943, where Pilecki immediately began writing a comprehensive report about Auschwitz. May 20, 1943 found Witold Pilecki in a safe house in Warsaw's Kolobors district, writing furiously to document everything he had witnessed in Auschwitz. His hands cramped after hours of continuous writing, but he pushed through the pain, knowing that this report might be his only chance to force Allied action. The document he produced, known as Witold's Report, eventually reached 100 pages of detailed testimony about the camp's operations, the systematic murder program, the resistance network he had built, and recommendations for military intervention. The report described the camp's physical layout with precision that only an engineer or military officer could provide. It detailed the number of prisoners, the death rates from disease, starvation, execution, and the gas chambers. It named SS officers responsible for specific atrocities. It provided evidence of the industrial-scale murder program that the Nazis were attempting to hide from international scrutiny. Pilecki wrote in clear, factual language, avoiding emotional appeals in favor of documented observations that could be verified and acted upon. He presented the report to leaders of the Home Army, the largest Polish resistance organization, which had evolved from earlier groups including the one Pilecki had helped establish. General Tadeusz Bohumorowski reviewed the document with growing horror. The Home Army Command knew about German brutality, had received earlier reports from Auschwitz and other camps, but Pilecki's comprehensive testimony from inside the system provided undeniable evidence. The question was what could be done about it. Pilecki advocated strongly for an immediate armed assault on Auschwitz. He argued that his resistance network inside the camp, which remained active even after his escape, could coordinate an uprising if external forces attacked the SS guards and security perimeter. He proposed dropping Allied paratroopers or Polish special forces near the camp, breaching the fences and guard towers, distributing weapons to the prisoner resistance, and fighting their way out with as many prisoners as could be evacuated. He estimated that thousands of lives could be saved if action came quickly. The Home Army leadership faced an impossible calculation. They had limited resources, stretched thin across occupied Poland, fighting a guerrilla war against vastly superior German forces. An attack on Auschwitz would require significant manpower and weapons that were desperately needed elsewhere. It would likely result in massive casualties among the attacking force with uncertain chances of success. Even if the assault succeeded in breaching the camp, evacuating prisoners through German-controlled territory would be extremely difficult, and German reprisals against Polish civilians would be catastrophic. Beyond these practical considerations lay a darker political reality. According to research published in Fighting Auschwitz by Joseph Gerlifsky, which provides extensive documentation of resistance activities in the camp, Allied command structures had already decided that the strategic priority was defeating Germany through conventional military operations rather than diverting resources to rescue missions. The British Air Force had declined requests to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, arguing that it would divert bombers from attacks on German industrial capacity and that the technical challenges of precision bombing made such missions unlikely to succeed. Pilecki's report was forwarded to London through underground courier systems. The Polish government in exile received it and passed copies to British intelligence and eventually American authorities. The response was devastating. Acknowledgement of the information but no commitment to military action. The liberation of concentration camps would come only as Allied armies advanced through occupied territories during conventional military campaigns, not through special rescue operations. The calculus of total war meant that millions would die in camps, while Allied bombers focused on factories and oil refineries. Faced with this reality, Pilecki continued working with the Home Army in other capacities. His fame within the resistance had grown tremendously. He was the man who had voluntarily entered hell, survived almost 3 years, and escaped to tell the truth. He was assigned to intelligence work in Warsaw, helping coordinate resistance activities and preparing for the moment when Poland might be liberated. But liberation from the Nazis would bring challenges he could not yet imagine, challenges that would make even Auschwitz seem like only one chapter in his long nightmare. August 1, 1944, arrived with the sound of Soviet artillery rumbling in the distance like approaching thunder. The Red Army was driving westward through occupied Poland, pushing German forces back toward the Reich after years of brutal warfare. For many Poles, this brought hope that liberation was finally at hand. For Witold Pilecki and others who remembered Soviet occupation in 1939 through 1941, the approaching Red Army brought complicated feelings. Liberation from the Nazis was desperately needed, but what would Soviet occupation bring? The Home Army Command made a fateful decision. They would launch an uprising in Warsaw before Soviet forces arrived, liberating the capital through Polish efforts and establishing Polish sovereignty before foreign powers could impose their own political solutions. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1 with approximately 40,000 Polish resistance fighters attacking German positions throughout the city. The plan assumed that Soviet forces, which had reached the Vistula River on Warsaw's eastern bank, would quickly cross and support the uprising. Pilecki commanded a unit in the Rodmy Sea district, fighting street by street against German forces. The initial attacks went well, with resistance fighters capturing significant portions of the city. But the Germans responded with overwhelming force. Heinrich Himmler ordered the complete destruction of Warsaw and the murder of its population in retaliation for the uprising. SS units specializing in anti-partisan warfare entered the city, including formations responsible for atrocities across occupied Europe. What followed was a nightmare of urban combat, with Polish civilians caught between German brutality and desperate resistance. The Soviet forces stopped at the Vistula and did not advance. Stalin apparently decided to let the Germans destroy the Home Army, eliminating potential opposition to Soviet control of Poland. Historical debate continues about Soviet motivations, with some historians arguing military exhaustion forced the halt, while others see deliberate political calculation. The practical result was catastrophic for Warsaw. The uprising lasted 63 days, ending in October 1944, with approximately 15,000 resistance fighters killed, 200,000 civilians dead, and Warsaw systematically destroyed by German demolition teams. Pilecki fought throughout the uprising, leading his unit in desperate combat against German forces equipped with artillery, armor, and air support. The resistance had mostly small arms, captured weapons, and improvised explosives. They fought from buildings and sewers, establishing barricades and defensive positions that German forces systematically destroyed. The civilian population suffered enormously, caught in crossfire, executed in mass killings by SS units. or burned alive when Germans set entire neighborhoods on fire. When the uprising finally collapsed, surviving resistance fighters received combatant status and were transported to German prisoner of war camps under the Geneva Convention, a status the Germans had refused to grant partisans earlier in the war. Pilecki was sent to a POW camp in Germany, watching Warsaw burn behind him as the train departed. The city he had fought to defend, the capital of Polish independence, was being systematically reduced to rubble by German demolition experts. Approximately 85% of the city would be destroyed before the Germans finally withdrew. Pilecki spent the winter of 1944 and early 1945 in German POW camps. Far better conditions than Auschwitz, but still marked by hunger, cold, and uncertainty. The war was clearly ending. Allied forces were closing in from both east and west. But Pilecki worried increasingly about what peace would bring. The conferences at Tehran and Yalta had already outlined the post-war order, and it was becoming clear that Poland would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. The Western Allies would not risk confrontation with their Soviet partner over Polish sovereignty. In May 1945, American forces liberated Pilecki's POW camp. He was free from German captivity, but his war was far from over. The Poland he had fought to defend no longer existed in meaningful independence. Soviet forces occupied the country, and a communist government was being established under Moscow's direction. The Home Army was being systematically dismantled, its members arrested, exiled, or forced underground again. Pilecki faced an impossible choice: remain in the West with other Polish exiles, safe but powerless, or return to Poland and continue the fight against yet another foreign occupation. December 15, 1945, marked Witold Pilecki's decision to make what many considered a suicidal choice. After months in displaced persons camps in Italy, connected with the Polish Second Corps which had fought alongside the Allies, he chose to return to Soviet-occupied Poland. The decision shocked his fellow resistance veterans, who recognized that returning meant almost certain arrests by the communist security services. But Pilecki believed that intelligence gathering on Soviet activities was essential, that the struggle for Polish independence had merely changed opponents. The Polish government in exile in London authorized his return as part of intelligence operations against the Soviet-backed communist regime being established in Warsaw. General Władysław Anders, commanding Polish forces in the West, had grave concerns about sending men back into what was becoming a Stalinist police state. But he also understood the need for intelligence networks inside Poland. Pilecki traveled under false papers, using the name Roman Jezeski, crossing from Italy into Poland through clandestine routes established by intelligence services. The Poland he returned to in early 1946 bore scars far deeper than German occupation had inflicted. 6 million Polish citizens had died during the war, approximately 17% of the pre-war population. The Jewish community, which had numbered over 3 million, had been almost completely annihilated in the Holocaust. Cities lay in ruins, particularly Warsaw, which was little more than rubble. But, beyond the physical destruction, the country's political landscape had been fundamentally reshaped by Soviet power. The Communist Polish Committee of National Liberation, backed by Soviet military might, was transforming Poland into a satellite state. The security apparatus, known as the Urzęd Bezpieczeństwa, or UB, operated with methods that Pilecki found disturbingly familiar from both Nazi Gestapo and Soviet NKVD practices. Former resistance members were being arrested as fascists and reactionaries. Show trials were already beginning. The NKVD operated openly in Poland, advising the UB on interrogation techniques and identifying potential opposition. Pilecki established contact with remnants of the Home Army network that had gone underground after the Soviet occupation. Many former resistance members had formed a new organization called Wolność, or Freedom and Independence, dedicated to opposing communist control just as they had opposed Nazi occupation. Pilecki gathered intelligence on Soviet troop dispositions, political arrests, economic exploitation, and the methods being used to impose totalitarian control. He sent reports to London through courier networks, information that helped the West understand the Soviet consolidation of power in Eastern Europe. But the security situation deteriorated rapidly. The UB had infiltrated resistance networks with informers, some motivated by communist ideology, but many simply trying to protect themselves or their families in the new order. In May 1947, after approximately 18 months of underground work, the UB arrested Pilecki. The arrest was no random sweep, but a targeted operation that indicated betrayal from within the resistance network. Multiple sources were later identified as having provided information about his activities and location. The arrest marked the beginning of Pilecki's final ordeal. He was transported to Mokotów prison in Warsaw, the same facility that had held political prisoners under German occupation and was now serving the same function under communist control. The interrogation techniques combined physical torture with psychological pressure designed to break prisoners into signing false confessions. The UB wanted Pilecki to confess to espionage for foreign powers, to implicate other resistance members, and to denounce his activities against the communist government. According to testimony later given by fellow prisoners and documented in records that became available after the fall of communism, Pilecki endured months of brutal treatment. Interrogators beat him repeatedly, deprived him of sleep for days at a time, and subjected him to mock executions designed to create psychological trauma. They threatened his wife and children, claiming they would be arrested and tortured if he didn't cooperate. They showed him confessions allegedly signed by other resistance members implicating him in various crimes, some real and others entirely fabricated. Despite the torture, Pilecki refused to provide information that would endanger others still at large. He admitted to activities that the UB already knew about, but declined to elaborate on network structures or identify collaborators. His interrogators, frustrated by his resistance, eventually constructed a case based on partial confessions, informer testimony, and fabricated evidence. The charges against him included espionage, preparing assassination attempts against security officials, and working to overthrow the communist government. March 3, 1948, brought Witold Pilecki before a military court in Warsaw on charges that carried only one possible sentence. The trial was a grotesque mockery of justice, a scripted performance designed to eliminate a dangerous symbol of resistance while terrorizing others who might oppose the regime. The courtroom was filled with security officials and carefully selected observers. No independent journalists attended, no foreign observers were permitted, and the proceedings would not be publicly reported until decades later, when communist archives were finally opened. The presiding judge, Lieutenant Colonel Jan Ryszkowian, had been carefully selected for his reliability. The prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Miszkowski, presented the case with theatrical denunciations of Pilecki as a fascist agent working for foreign imperialism. The specific charges included collecting intelligence for the Polish government in exile, maintaining contacts with Western intelligence services, recruiting members for illegal organizations, and planning terrorist attacks against representatives of the people's government. Pilecki stood in the defendant's box. visibly marked by months of torture but maintaining dignity that clearly unsettled his prosecutors. His defense attorney, Stanisław Lisowski, had been assigned by the court and made only perfunctory efforts to challenge the prosecution's case. In communist show trials, defense attorneys understood that aggressive defense of accused enemies of the state could result in their own arrests. The outcome had been predetermined before the trial began, making the proceedings merely an exercise in legitimizing a political execution. The testimony against Pilecki came primarily from informers and former resistance members who had been broken by interrogation. They recited prepared statements about meetings and activities, some true but presented in distorted context, others entirely fabricated. The prosecution characterized Pilecki's return to Poland as espionage for hostile foreign powers rather than patriotic opposition to foreign occupation. His wartime heroism at Auschwitz was either ignored or reframed as adventurism serving reactionary forces. When given opportunity to speak, Pilecki denied planning terrorist activities but acknowledged gathering intelligence and opposing the communist government. He stated clearly that he considered the Soviet-backed regime to be another foreign occupation, no more legitimate than the Nazi occupation he had fought during the war. He argued that his actions were consistent with defending Polish independence and sovereignty, the same principles that had guided him since youth. The court proceedings record, preserved in Polish archives and later published by historian Adam Syra, shows that Pilecki remained defiant even knowing the inevitable verdict. The trial lasted barely 3 days. On March 15, 1948, the court delivered its verdict, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. Pilecki received the judgment without visible emotion, a reaction that his guards found disturbing. He was returned to Mokotów prison to await execution, held in solitary confinement to prevent any final communications with the outside world. The appeals process, mandatory even in show trials, was completed with perfunctory speed. The sentence was upheld, and an execution date was set. May 25, 1948 was the last day of Witold Pilecki's life. He was 47 years old, had survived Auschwitz and German POW camps, had fought in multiple wars and uprisings, and had faced death countless times. His final letters to his family, which would not be delivered to them for decades, revealed a man at peace with his choices. He expressed love for his wife and children, sorrow that he would not see them grow, but no regret for the path he had chosen. The execution was carried out in the basement of Mokotów prison with a single shot to the back of the head. The communists disposed of his body in an unmarked grave, location unknown even to his family. They wanted no shrine for future resistance, no place where his memory could be honored. His name was forbidden from public mention, erased from Polish history as completely as the communist authorities could manage. His family faced official harassment for decades, their connection to a declared enemy of the state bringing them under constant surveillance and limiting their opportunities. November 4, 1989, brought scenes to Warsaw that Witold Pilecki could never have imagined. The Berlin Wall had fallen the previous night, and across Eastern Europe, communist regimes were collapsing like dominoes. Poland had already begun its transformation months earlier when partially free elections in June produced a stunning victory for Solidarity, the independent trade union that had challenged communist control throughout the 1980s. The apparatus of totalitarian control that had executed Pilecki and thousands of others was crumbling, and with its collapse came the possibility of historical justice. The process of clearing Pilecki's name began slowly as Poland transitioned from communism to democracy. In 1990, after the complete collapse of the communist government, efforts began to review political trials from the Stalinist era. Thousands of cases needed examination, decades of falsified justice requiring correction. Pilecki's family, who had lived under the shadow of his conviction, began advocating for his rehabilitation. The Polish courts reopened his case in 1990. The evidence of injustice was overwhelming once examined without political prejudice. The confessions had been extracted through torture. The witnesses had been coerced. The charges of terrorism and espionage for hostile powers were distortions of legitimate resistance to foreign occupation. On October 1, 1990, the Polish Supreme Court formally overturned Pilecki's conviction, declaring him innocent of all charges and recognizing that his execution had been a judicial murder committed by the communist regime. But legal rehabilitation, while important, could not restore the decades of obscurity during which Pilecki's extraordinary story had been suppressed. His report from Auschwitz had languished in archives. His role in establishing resistance networks inside the camp had been forgotten, and his incredibly courageous decision to voluntarily enter the camp was unknown to the broader public. Historians began piecing together his story from scattered documents, interviewing survivors who had known him, and gradually revealing the full scope of his heroism. The publication of his complete Auschwitz report in 1991 brought international attention. Western historians, Holocaust scholars, and the general public learned for the first time about the intelligence network he had built inside Auschwitz, the detailed reports he had smuggled out, and the frustrated attempts to convince Allied powers to take action. The story challenged comfortable narratives about what the Allies knew and when they knew it, revealing that detailed information about Nazi extermination programs had reached London and Washington years before the camps were liberated. Poland began the process of honoring Pilecki's memory. In 1995, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. The Polish government awarded him the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest civilian decoration. Streets and schools were named in his honor. A memorial was erected at the location where Mokotów prison had stood, commemorating him and thousands of others murdered by the communist regime. His story entered school curricula, ensuring that new generations of Poles would know about his sacrifice. International recognition came more slowly, but eventually arrived. In 2006, Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial considered recognizing Pilecki as righteous among the nations. The designation for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Though his primary mission had been intelligence gathering rather than specifically rescuing Jews, his reports had documented the Holocaust as it was happening, and his resistance network had helped prisoners of all backgrounds survive. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum includes extensive exhibits about his intelligence work and the underground network he established. The final honor came in 2013, when Polish investigators, using modern forensic techniques and historical research, attempted to locate Pilecki's remains. The search focused on areas around the former Pałaski Cemetery in Warsaw, where the communists had buried executed political prisoners in unmarked graves. Though his exact remains could not be definitively identified due to decades of disturbance and incomplete records, a symbolic grave was established where survivors, historians, and Polish officials could pay respects. Today, Witold Pilecki is recognized as one of the greatest heroes of World War II, a man whose courage staggers the imagination. He voluntarily entered Auschwitz, survived almost 3 years of unimaginable horror, escaped to tell the truth, fought in the Warsaw Uprising, returned to occupied Poland knowing the risks, and paid the ultimate price for his principles. His story embodies the tragedy of Poland itself. a nation caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, fighting for independence against overwhelming odds, betrayed by circumstances and geopolitics. His legacy extends beyond his personal heroism to profound questions about moral courage and historical memory. How many other stories were suppressed by communist regimes for decades? What other heroes died in obscurity because their resistance to Soviet occupation was as unacceptable to post-war powers as their resistance to Nazi occupation had been heroic? The rehabilitation of Pilecki's memory represents not just justice for one man, but recognition of countless others who fought for freedom and were erased from history. The soldier who escaped both the Nazis and the Soviets ultimately could not escape the totalitarian century that destroyed so many lives and suppressed so many truths. But his story survived, preserved in documents and memories that outlasted the regimes that tried to erase him. In the end, truth proved more durable than tyranny, memory more powerful than propaganda, and courage more lasting than the systems of terror that sought to extinguish the human spirit. Witold Pilecki's name now stands alongside the greatest heroes of the 20th century, a testament to the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil.